Hi,
Oh,
is this Bernard Sietman? Or
yes.
this is Lucy Kahn.
Hi, Lucy. How are
Hi,
you?
I'm good. Is this an okay time to talk?
It's perfect time.
All right, cool.
Yep.
Thank you so much for agreeing to do this very spur of the moment interview.
Yeah. Well, tell me about your project.
Yeah, so basically at SES right now, us seniors are doing projects in small groups where we are creating a campaign to raise awareness about our freshwater mussels here in Minnesota, since so many of them are like threatened and endangered, and
Hmm.
they're so essential to our ecosystems. So, yeah.
Excellent. Okay.
Yeah.
That
So,
sounds like a really worthwhile piece of work.
thank you.
Yeah. So what? Remind me. You said SES. Is that what you said, or
Yeah, the School of Environmental Studies.
School of Environmental Studies? And that's in Apple Valley, right?
Yep.
Okay. Got it. Got it.
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, what are you interested in knowing about?
Yeah, so I, know that you work with the Minnesota Statewide Mussel Survey. Um, and so I'm just kind of curious, like, what, um, what is that? What does, like, working for them entail? And how do you work, with mussels?
Okay. So yeah. So the um, the statewide survey is the statewide mussel survey is a piece of. So it's the depart. I work for the Department of Natural Resources,
Yeah.
and so the statewide survey is more so was, but still is a significant part of what we do, and basically it's survey being where a crew of people go and do a timed search. It doesn't have to be a timed search, but we do a timed search with 2 to 4 people, usually 4, and collect all of the live mussels that we can in a
Okay.
period of time, usually about it varies, but it can range from 20 minutes to 2 hours of total search time.
Yeah.
And during that time, we collect all the live mussels, and we also collect shells of other species that we didn't find alive.
Mm.
And so you can imagine so that work, it is, statewide, so it can be, we can do, we've done over the years, and we're talking, since, beginning in 1999,
Wow.
and yeah, I know it's been a long time. Like I said, most of that work was most of that. We haven't done been really involved in that in a entire summer like
Yeah.
process. So at one time we did surveys. I mean, literally that was the main objective of the work that we did, and that was, and so the reason that we do that, the reason we did that, and it ranges. What I was going to say was it ranges from small streams to big rivers like the Mississippi, and we usually approach it at a watershed. So we would just tackle different watersheds, and there are like 81. I guess there's certain size hydrologic unit watersheds. For example, the Cottonwood River drainage within the Minnesota River system, which is part of the Mississippi. So I mean, there's these segments. So we would tackle them, watershed by watershed, usually. And so what we get from that is we didn't really know what the status and distribution of all of the species were in the state, and that's really important to get an assessment of which species need protection, which watersheds have intact or possibly more impacted mussel assemblages. We also found new species to the state, new distribution records, but we over the years, in all we've sampled. It's getting close to 4,000 independent sites. So it's a lot of work, and so that work basically provided the basis for deciding places around the state to establish long-term monitoring sites, which are more quantitative in nature. That meaning that we, as opposed to a count of the species, of individuals of a species over amount of time, the monitoring part of it is where we get density estimates, by actually doing really more intensive sampling of small quadrats, quarter-meter square quadrats, and then getting density estimates and population estimates. And you're able to do to have a more quantitative comparison over time. It's just a more rigorous sampling method. And from the survey data, we also were able to identify mussel conservation priorities. What species did we want to propagate? What species were extirpated from X watershed or river reach that we could start doing restoration work, and then all that data also has, as I mentioned, it provided a basis for establishing what species were listed as threatened or endangered or special concern, and of course that has a lot of implications for environmental reviews when certain construction or other types of projects that could potentially impact mussels, we know where the rare things are. And so that's sort of, maybe the long-winded version of what the statewide mussel survey is. Yeah, and we still do that, and we're repeating some of that stuff too.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, no. Yeah, that helps a lot. I was kind of curious. So, you said monitor. Do you mean that as in, like, you would go to sites and kind of repeat surveys over time, or kind of just observe as to?
No, yeah, it's a repeat. Yeah, so at those monitoring sites, that work can be repeated, well, forever. I mean, literally. Those data from that monitoring, not only during my career, in the careers of other folks that work in our program, but I mean, we're talking decades down the road, can go back and repeat the exact same thing and compare data on a time scale. Yeah, and in terms of monitoring, we also monitor, reintroduction. So, I
Mm-hmm.
use the term, as it relates to the mussel survey, the monitoring sites that we set up, and also monitoring sites that had been established even before we started, and are run by other that are on border waters like the St. Croix that we go back and sample
Yeah.
with partners in Wisconsin and the Corps of Engineers and the National Park Service too. So
Oh,
there's a number of monitoring sites we have, but
yeah.
some of them like the area near between, in Lakeland, Minnesota, and Hudson, Wisconsin, that area of the St. Croix.
Yeah.
We have a long-term monitoring site there, and at Interstate Park, and then some other sites that the Corps of Engineers, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and their Ecological Services Division, that they maintain that data, but we collaborate with them on that monitoring because it's also in Minnesota waters too. But as far as monitoring, in the context of mussel restoration and reintroducing mussels that we have propagated and grown, we also monitor the success of those and monitor sites that in a different way usually, but sometimes it includes the quantitative aspect that I mentioned earlier. But basically, to get a gauge of, is what we're doing working? Do we find that there's mussel recruitment out there? And so we have to monitor that, over time also, to see whether or not it's having, if the results are what we hope for, or what are they at all? Are we seeing any benefits and response of the mussels that we reintroduce?
Yeah. Um, so as in talking about restoration efforts, um, what do you think, I mean, like, as a state, what can we, like, do to help, help the mussel population? And also, like, what can we as, like, individual people do?
So what can the state do, as in terms of like the government and the people in general?
Yeah, yeah. And then also, like, what can individual people do, if anything?
Yeah. Well, the things that we do as a state, in terms of restoration, you said what can we do? I'll put that in the context of what are we doing,
Mm.
and then if I think of anything that we're not doing that we could be doing, I'll pop that off. But I'll have to think about that for a minute. But
Yeah.
the things that we are doing. In terms of restoration, well, one big thing that the state is doing, and at certain components of the state, and actually within our program, is restoring river ecosystems. So we're there is active work going on to remove dams.
Mm.
And that not only helps rivers in general,
Yeah.
in terms of, I don't know how much you know about, the effects of dams on things, but they have
We,
an
yeah.
they have an especially negative impact on mussels, but also
Yeah.
on other things,
Yeah.
fish, and, because of their effect on, the habitat that they inundate from the impounded reach, and also the fragmentation of rivers by dams. So what have you guys learned about dams?
Yeah, we've actually talked about dams quite a bit. Actually, like, to my memory, what brought on the Mussel Project was kind of talking about, talking about the effects, of dams and other such human activity with our rivers and our bodies of water that heavily affects those ecosystems. And so, like, what I can remember off the top of my head is that, a big part of mussel reproduction and mussel life is actually sediment that, is kind of created by the river. And dams tend to get rid of that sediment and make much more clean edge kind of rivers. And
So were dams put into a positive light?
kind of negative.
Yeah, negative. Yeah, negative. Yeah. Well, that is true. I mean, they do hold back sediment. There's no doubt that they hold back sediment.
Yeah.
But that storage of sediment, I guess I haven't thought about it in terms of whether in terms of what how that affects the downstream reaches in terms of, but sediment transport is a it's a standard thing that rivers do when sediment gets into the river. And excessive sediment is an issue. I mean, excessive sediment from erosion and especially in places like the Minnesota River Basin, which is a lot more susceptible to that. It's really there aren't many dams on the Minnesota River, but there is a massive amount of sediment pollution and instability. So it is quite a big problem, and a lot of that is from the rapid removal of the rapid runoff of water from drain tiling into the river that creates a quick pulse of flow in the river as opposed to a slower pulse, and that promotes erosion. But that's another, that's off the topic of what you were saying about about your question. But it is a big problem in that system and in some other places too that are susceptible to erosion. But as far as some other stuff that that the state is doing, we the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. I mean, I'm getting off the top. You said state, and so I'm tossing them out there.
I'm happy to talk about all of this. This is very useful information. But
the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency is well, I mean, they set standards. So one of the main things they do is set water quality standards, and they also monitor river health for impairment, and base that on a variety of things, but it also includes certain types of aquatic life. They don't include freshwater mussels into their work, but that's there's probably the science and certain aspects of the way that they measure they use insects and fish, and so there's a longer history of measuring and using those type of animals in assessing watershed health, and so that's what they use. So at any rate, but they, obviously they measure other things too, chemical pollutants and a variety of things, total suspended solids, of E. coli, lots of things. But at any rate, they, the things that they do, they monitor the health of watersheds and lakes, and the DNR does too, in certain ways. So both agencies do those kind of things, but MPCA is heavy into that as a department themselves, and so that's even though water quality, there's pluses and minuses to the trends of water quality, but compared to the 1800s and early 1900s, water quality is a lot better than it was. But there's a lot of different issues, and there weren't, there's a lot more different things in the water too that weren't there. But the sewage is less of an issue. I'll put it that way. That's one way to look at it. There's more swimmable water than there was at one time. And if you want to get back to, mussels in general, the things that we're doing, as far as, restoring, populations, ideally, a goal of our program is that, we would reestablish, the historic mussel assemblages and in, all the rivers that where all the species components were present, and the listing status of species would, delisting would be appropriate. That would be a great. There'd be a great, point to be at where we didn't have endangered mussels anymore. And so, we've been doing mussel restoration not that long, but we're working on a smaller set of species, but still having some success on some rare species and putting them back where they occurred.
Yeah. And then
you ask about people. You ask about what people can do.
Yeah. Like what can us individuals do to help?
Yep. So I think that so as a general, as we'll just say, anyone is an individual. If you have interest in the environment, interest in clean water, and we didn't mention the benefits of mussels. And I don't know if we can talk about what benefits mussels have, but to get to your question, you can join a river advocacy group, because those organizations, and this could be it could be a lake association if you live if you have a particular lake that you have a cabin on, or it can be an entire river, like Clean Up the River Environment, which focuses primarily on the Minnesota River watershed, and helping with the work that they do, all of which the more advocacy you have, the more outreach there is, learning the issues, learning how to, talk about those things and sort of spreading the word about the importance of mussels to the ecosystem, and some of the cool things about their biology, and things that kind of attract people, and maybe just give them some information that they would go, wow, I had no idea, about the life cycle and lures and the relationship to fish and the way that they clean water, and that, that healthy mussel assemblages, are attractive to other types of animals because of the benefits that they provide to aquatic systems by the filtering and the depositing of by basically capturing energy from the water column when they're eating and filtering water and depositing that has benefits for other benthic animals, and that works its way up the food web in aquatic systems. I mean, it's basically they make all this energy that is floating down the river in the form of algae and fungi and bacteria. They make that available to other animals by filtering out the water, which is it's otherwise just fine particles that other animals can't use. So they get to use that. They clean the water during that during that process, and then they make that energy available to other animals. So they benefit a lot of things. Their shells are habitat for fish and for other aquatic animals like crayfish, and for nesting and egg-laying sites for snails, and a variety of things. So they're beneficial in a lot of ways. Yeah. And so spreading that kind of information to folks, they go, wow, that's really fantastic. Wish we had more mussels. And they'll say, oh yeah, I remember seeing some mussels, when I was a kid walking in a creek or along the lake when I was, piddling around or swimming or whatever. And then they'll, think about that kind of stuff more.
Yeah. And so kind of coming off of that, I'm kind of curious, what are, obviously in class we've learned a bit about the benefits of mussels, but what really are the benefits, and what do they do in the ecosystem?
Okay, well, the benefits. So I just explained one of them. I may not have said it where it made a lot of sense about the filtering and removing suspended particles and sediment from the water column, that part of it. So did that and how that energy they capture, that they deposit when they basically it's uneaten food and feces that are packaged into little pellets. That's a direct link to all of that energy that's floating down the river that makes it available for other animals. So that's one thing. That's one big benefit. They cycle nutrients, so they also incorporate phosphorus and nitrogen into their bodies. But in addition to calcium, but so they can actually remove phosphorus from the water, and or at least, let me back up. I don't want to say they can remove phosphorus. That is not the case. But they play a role in phosphorus and nitrogen cycling, and in different ways they can accumulate those in they can accumulate those.
Yeah.
They well, I mean, they have cultural and aesthetic benefits, and existence benefits. So you know, they were important and are important to indigenous cultures and to certain cultures in other for other groups. Just their variety and diversity is it's an interesting thing, but it's also it's part of the. I mean, it's not necessarily a benefit, but it's a reason for protection because of their great diversity in North America.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think. I know there are others, but my mind is not coming up with some of them. I'm trying to think about some other, actual benefits besides, the water, the main things of water, clarification and into as far as the dynamics of the aquatic food web. It might pop into my brain a little bit more, maybe perhaps later, but yeah.
Yeah. I actually coming from that, I actually have a couple questions. So you were mentioning that mussels, they kind of drop pellets. So does that
technically pseudo-feces? Yeah, it's called pseudo-feces.
Pseudo-feces.
Yeah, I know it's a funny name.
Well, it's interesting. So does that provide? I don't know if any organism that really chooses to eat feces, but I mean, does it provide food for any of the species, or does it serve any direct purpose?
Yeah, it is food. So just think of it this way. So the reason they call it pseudo feces is not all feces. So basically, it's little mucus bound packages of uneaten filtered material. So mussels don't eat everything they filter.
Yeah.
They sort stuff out. So they actually have a pretty sophisticated little system to filter it out, capture it in mucus on the gills, and then it goes through some labial palps, which are basically some of it gets shunted to the mouth, others get shunted to it's the anus area, and those components are packaged together in pseudo-feces, and that stuff is eaten by I mean, number one, it's broken down by fungi and bacteria, but also it's eaten by other we're talking, there's tons of types of aquatic invertebrates, macroinvertebrates, and smaller little invertebrates, animals of a variety of types, and they eat that. And when mussels excrete, and so in addition to that, mussels, they do excrete some ammonia. And that can, and depending on the system, if it's in nutrient, okay, so not to get too technical, but in nutrient limited systems, where there's not a lot of ammonia or phosphorus in the system already, mussels can promote algae growth of beneficial types, not negative blue-green, but algae, which of course other animals like snails and grazers graze on that, and so. And so, yeah, animals eat the pseudo-feces. They can promote algae growth, and even on their shells. And so grazers, can be crawling on the shells and grazing on the periphyton and algae on their shells. So that energy that I discussed, I mean, is the primary thing. Other animals eat it, and then of course, the way the system works, there's always a bigger fish, and so and so it just goes up the line, and it does get to fish. Eventually, it gets to fish because if crayfish are eating this, little aquatic insects, and then other insects are eating those insects, or smaller fish, bigger fish eat smaller fish. I mean, it's a whole. So it gets into this. It gets into the food web from mussels capturing it, where it otherwise was not available by and large.
Yeah.
It's pretty crazy. Now, see, think about it this way.
Yeah.
So, think about it in a historical context. So, when early explorers were out scouring, rivers in North America, looking to describe new species of fish and mussels and all kinds of things. These guys were treading, in rivers, and there are historical accounts in rivers and where they said you could walk miles of a river and never set foot without treading on a live mussel. They were that abundant and widespread. So I mean, historically, in those kind of scenes. I mean, I'm not sure that they may not exist. If they do, it's really rare. But I mean, the idea that mussels are so abundant that they literally pave the river bottom. So you can imagine what kind of effect they would have when they're filtering. I mean, these assemblages of mussels would be filtering the water many times over. I mean, the entire volume of the river many times over as it flowed over them. And you can imagine the effect it had on water clarity and the importance of all that filtering to the aquatic animals there, and just their presence. I mean, just being that kind of dominant, they had to have, maybe effects that we don't even really, it's not like the science is, well established over many decades. It's not. It's still ongoing. So, there could be things that we don't even know that they do. But yeah, we're not talking about just a few mussels here. We're talking about, in a historical context, millions and millions and millions of mussels. And there are millions of mussels in the Mississippi River.
Yeah.
I mean, but just compound that.
Yeah. It's a significant amount less than at least what those historical accounts were.
Without a doubt.
Yeah.
Without a doubt.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah. And, that we have fewer species, too. I mean, Minnesota's lost species. North America's lost, about 30 species of mussels have gone extinct flat out. I mean, they're gone.
Wow.
Forever.
Yeah. Man.
Yeah, and that doesn't even account for the abundant, the decline in abundance.
Yeah.
in certain river systems, it's they're basically devoid of mussels or largely devoid of them, whereas they were not historically. So there's been lots of declines.
Yeah.
It's a worldwide thing. I mean, this is not a North American phenomenon. This is worldwide.
How does that affect those bodies of water that are completely without mussels?
Well, I mean, things still go on, things still happen, but those services that mussels provided are no longer there, and so without doing some kind of experiment of adding them back and seeing what how they would change, it's hard to know for sure. The best you could do would be a comparative type study, but usually where mussels are doing really, really well, those systems are a lot more diverse overall, and it's a combination. It's hard to know what plus or minus the mussels. I mean, there's a lot of other things that have gone right or bad in the opposite version. In those systems. You know what I'm saying? I mean, it's not just these places have lost mussels and that's all they've lost. Although, and I don't want to get too I don't want to get out of the but I guess the point being is that usually it's not just mussels that have been lost. So it's hard to either you have places that are less impacted or more impacted, and that affects the aquatic communities overall. But there is this phenomenon of enigmatic mussel declines, where you have certain rivers, mostly in the Eastern Highlands or the Highland. Basically it's in rivers that are less productive, where mussels are all that is declining, but other aquatic assemblages are comparatively unaffected. And I don't think folks have looked at those systems to answer the question that you asked. You know what I'm saying? So, you have a system that's otherwise in maybe, in better condition and has, intact fish assemblages, intact invertebrate assemblages, but the mussels are gone, and the work is still being done to try to figure out what's going on with that. And at any rate, there has not been, to my knowledge, not been any work on an analysis to see what the loss of those services that mussels provide is doing to the system. It's a really good question.
Yeah. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm unfortunately running out of time here. I mean, I have many other things. Sorry, that was a message I got. I have, many other things that I'd love, to ask you about. But I think you've given me an amazing amount of information, and very insightful information. So I thank you for that.
Well, you're very welcome. You had some fantastic questions, and I hope that I hope that it was helpful. If you have follow up, and if you have specifics on the propagation and restoration stuff, and want a different perspective or whatever, I would be happy to answer any questions down the road. I mean, I realize you probably have a certain amount of time that you have, but if you want any follow-up and want to talk specifically about propagation, for example, I can give you the name.